Hello everyone, this video is going to focus on organizing the argumentative research essay. This video is going to provide some strategies and considerations in regards to how to establish a claim. It'll also address some of the ways you can potentially organize your ideas, as well as how you can organize your body paragraphs using the PI method. Again, these are simply strategies. There's no one all be all end way to develop an argumentative research essay. Nevertheless, these are some surefire strategies that are going to assist in writing the most effective essay possible. So first, you'll want to start by making a claim about a particular topic. So this is going to serve as your thesis statement, but also your central claim, central argument about the particular topic you guys have been establishing over the course of the semester. You want to ensure that this claim is in fact a debatable one. As we argue with any thesis statement, if it's not debatable, chances are it's probably just a purpose statement. So in this regard, it needs to be reflected in the thesis statement. So you'll find that in your thesis, you will have your central claim that will be dictated by the key ideas and phrases that you have established and will focus the essence of your essay. So, for example, let's say that your topic is in regards to social media as far as your much broader topic. And then some claims about social media might include the following. Social media help people stay in touch across long distances. Social media are hurting the communication skills of young Americans. Social media are useful tools for social movements, and social media are responsible for slacktivism. Now, with that being said, in regards to the central claim, naturally, you will develop claims throughout the course of the essay that are going to serve as reasons or support for that central claim. Keep in mind that, again, you'll want to make sure that the claim is in fact debatable, that it says something about the topic or issue that is not necessarily common knowledge, or that most people have agreed upon. Otherwise, you're just kind of repeating or reiterating information that we already know. We've addressed the concept of adding to the conversation or moving the conversation forward in a debatable way. So that could be in a number of different aspects. It could be including new perspectives of participant people who are engaged or involved within that particular topic. It could include ethical aspects, economic, so whatever lens that you are examining your claim from or establishing your claim. So if we're looking at the topic of social media as an example, if we said something like many people use social media, we would argue that that's a pretty common knowledge and that many people do in fact use social media and not really something up for debate. Sometimes people would say that it is arguable because they don't use social media, and that would be anecdotal. But if we know that and have observed that many people do in fact use social media, it is not necessarily something we can argue and wouldn't be a strong enough claim. However, if we say something to the likes of social media are hurting the communication skills of young Americans, we would now say that this is something that is debatable because the fact is that we have the phrase hurting the communication skills, more specifically of young Americans. There are 2 points of debate: how it hurts communication skills, and then more specifically those of young Americans. So throughout the course of the essay, this would be supported, of course, by additional claims, reasons why. Why would we say that it's hurting communication skills? As well as specifically why is hurting communication skills of young Americans. And then throughout those claims presented in the essay, you will have your evidence to support those claims. Once you have established a thesis statement or main claim, many students like to start with the introduction paragraph, or how do they begin their argument. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the intro per se. In some cases, the intro can be multiple paragraphs long. Depends on how much you need to contextualize the argument or set the argument or claim up. But if you're one of those students who prefers to write the intro first and establish the argument first, some things that you can consider when beginning your essay. Some missteps, of course, tend to happen through the initial stages of the writing process, and that's okay. Sometimes we just need to get started writing before we can even begin thinking about all the logical, organizational stuff. And that's fine if that's something that you need to do, but be sure that if you are not really paying much attention to the intro at first round of writing, that you go back and revisit it, especially after you've developed your entire paper. It's incredibly important to go back to the intro to ensure that you have in fact presented the argument, as I've indicated before, by identifying and defining that it matches with the rest of the essay. So in some cases, students start off with overwhelmingly broad or obvious concepts or terms or definitions and doesn't really present the argument in a strong way as far as contextualizing it and giving a sense of purpose as to why this argument is happening anyway. So it will be important to aim to try to start the essay in a very specific way. So more experienced writers tend to do this, where they just start off with introducing the problem, observation, event, situation that has prompted this discussion or debate to begin with. So while there's no strict formula, it often some of the effective introductions tend to include the following: introducing the problem or the issue that one has observed or is contending. Explain the problem or topic significance to a community that may include the reader or not. It just really depends on who the audience is. Make a debatable claim about the topic or issue in your thesis statement, of course, and supporting arguments if presented. And then explain how the thesis contributes to the conversation in some way. So it's likely that you're not going to list out these things. They will be established in, clear and coherent sentences and explanations for all of this. But, don't get caught up on the idea that it all has to be condensed into one. The goal is for clarity and coherency and conciseness. And, the more simple, the better. Sometimes when we present things in a clear way, it helps to organize the reader and prepare them for what to expect in the essay naturally. But more importantly, establishing these aspects in preparation for your argument, again, gives us insight as to what you, the writer, knows. So we as a reader are able to identify even from the very beginning, before you start into your arguments, whether or not you know what you're talking about. So if you're identifying and defining something and it's completely off base to what the discourse that takes place is, then already you have established some weaker levels of credibility, and that prompts the reader to be suspect of anything else that you write. So this is incredibly important to make sure that it's on point. Sometimes people like to capture the attitudes and perceptions already. It really is just going to depend on who your audience is and the approach. So while you might have these types of strategies, how you actually approach or frame them is going to be different. And of course, depending on your topic, context, and audience, all that is going to be dictated on how you might approach it. So with that being said, one strategy, of course, is to provide information or data to draw the reader's attention. And as I said, as far as your audience is concerned, if you know they are data driven, this might be one of those approaches that you take to get started versus maybe an anecdote or storytelling or whatever the case might be. So in this example, as you can read here, talking about the topics of electric cars, but they get into information and data regarding, of course, the sales of them. And in this aspect, by introducing it from that perspective, we know already that some aspect of economics is going to be addressed within this particular article, simply because how they present it in this way, or the data or information they chose. So while we know that there's tons of data about electric cars in many different facets and layers and aspects, that this writer decided to go with the data that revolves around the economics of it all, which provides a purpose and presence and context for the kinds of conversation that they're going to have. Another way to do it, as I said, is an anecdote. So an anecdote sort of provides a dramatization of a problem or issue. It could be by way of storytelling. It could be a personal experience, an observation of someone else's experience, or whatever the case might be. But the goal behind the anecdotes, as far as starting or establishing, the significance of it, gives a personal kind of a real reason. Why might my audience care, and why might that matter? And if this is the approach to take, because it draws the reader in and of course helps them to understand, then this might be the more effective approach than, let's say, the data or information is concerned. So next you have traditionally a quotation. Now be very cautious with quotations. Of course, you want to make sure that you understand them, that you're not taking them out of context either to fit your own needs. But again, the quotation serves as a point of observation. It was something you read or encountered. It had significance, right? It either caused or disrupted something. So there should be a rationale as to why you've selected the quote, not just for the sake of presenting it because it sounds nice, but it might be the point of reference of what you're actually going to be arguing against. So for some of you, your argumentative research essays is a response to something, right? And so if that's the case, this might be the way to go and present what the response is to that. And in this example, of course, is in a quote from Barack Obama, naturally. And as you see here, we start off with a quote. For the first time in nearly a decade, we have halted progress of the Iranian nuclear program. But if the program, now several decades old, had really been halted shortly after U.S. forces invaded neighboring Iraq, we would not be desperately pursuing agreements to stop it now, as about 10,000 centrifuges spin to enrich uranium. So here we have the keyword "but" here, which is going to be one of our word markers that we use to indicate what your position is, or the stance you're taking against the quote that has been provided. Okay. So as far as thesis statements is concerned, we've talked about thesis statements before earlier in the semester, but this should serve as a reminder, of course, as you are in the stages of developing, redeveloping, modifying your thesis statement. So as I indicated before, the thesis statement can serve as the point to share your main claim or central point of the essay, or you have the option to establish a thesis statement that will provide a forecast of supporting claims that will be presented in the essay. It really comes down to what you feel comfortable with and how you think you're going to design the organization of your essay. There is no one right way to do it. There's sort of this quote felt sense about what might be logically appropriate and not so overwhelming for your readers, but it really it comes down to the topic and how much information needs to be presented and how to manage it. So, as I said before, this is entirely up to you and something that we can chat about as soon as your draft is developed. So as an example, you see here a basic thesis statement: social media are used for tools for social movements. And while it could be the main claim, it doesn't really give us much more information about the claims that you're going to be making about the social movements, or the type of social media. So here, to expand, you can say social media sites like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube have been indispensable tools to young activists from Tahrir Square to Wall Street. So of course we have key concepts here, as I've indicated in the thesis video, about specific examples of the social media, so that way it doesn't open you up to all types. Here you have the three main ones, of course, which targets the audience familiarity, naturally. And then the concept of how they have been indispensable tools to young activists, so that will be another aspect that will be taking a chunk of your paper. And then more specifically, the examples of Tahrir Square and Wall Street. So there's no need to include any other elements as far as activism takes place, because you've designated what the focus of as far as space is concerned. So as you are designing these thesis statements, as I said before, it's always easier to revise an intro or thesis statement versus rewriting an entire essay. So that's something to consider as you are engaging in the revision stages. Next, you can use your thesis statement to help organize your ideas and your argument. Remember that The types of arguments that you're going to introduce, as presented in another video, will be found within these elements, but this aspect is how you're going to organize ideas, lay them out. And there are different ways to do that, as we indicated before, and using the same example about the social media sites like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. One aspect, as far as an organizational structure is concerned, is to break the essay down by the social medium, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and then getting into how they affect those two spaces. Or the alternative, of course, would be presenting the two spaces and then inserting underneath those spaces the different types of medium. As I said before, it really, comes down to how you feel your audience is going to understand best. As indicated in the other video, evidence is going to be a significant factor in here. So if you have a lot of evidence by way of, the space or the type of medium, that's kind of going to be something else you want to include as far as decision making with regards to how you're going to organize your paper. So you don't really know beforehand, to be honest. It's always a good idea to kind of have this step or at least a plan, a strategy. But be open to the idea that this may need to shift depending on how much information you're able to acquire, and of course, quality information or source material. Next, as far as organizing or using your thesis to organize your paper, again, you have these key ideas and to help guide you. Of course, if you promise something and then skip it, then naturally that's an area of weakness. So as I said before, before submitting your final copy of your writing, you want to verify that everything that you've addressed and how you organize it is mirrored in the introduction. So it kind of holds you accountable equally as it does in presenting the information to your audience in a logical way, or what they should expect anyway. So let's go ahead and talk about body paragraphs in an argumentative essay. Many times there is the perception that there should be a certain number of body paragraphs, that body paragraph should be number of sentences, and the reality is each type of body paragraph, number one, is rhetorically going to serve a different purpose, and especially how it's organized in the essay. So you may recall the beam model, where we know that the kinds of source information that we get is going to be used for different reasons. Well, similarly, body paragraphs are going to serve same rhetorical purposes. So for instance, you may have body paragraphs that will define certain key concepts, or paragraphs that help identify a problem, paragraphs that will offer the solution or call to action. It could also serve as your counterclaims, or presenting counter positions and rebuttaling them. You can also find that body paragraphs will primarily, and does take up majority of the essay, is to present your claims and the evidence to those claims. So this is the significant part. Where they go in the essay is going to be dependent on how you design and organize your writing. So for the sake of just this particular video, we're not going to talk about any of the organizational aspects, but sort of elements that need to be included, or points to consider as you structure your key paragraphs, that is those that include the claims and the evidence. In a body paragraph to support your thesis, one of the ways that we like to do this for argumentative research writing is to use the PI formula, which is point, illustrate, and explain. Now, as I said before, this is not the only way to do it. It depends on the type of body paragraph that you're writing. But for the most part, those of you who are writing paragraphs that include the claims and evidence, this is probably going to be your best bet, in that it helps in furthering your thesis by providing the claims, illustrating how the evidence or support or sourced material supports those claims, and then the explanation that demonstrates that to your audience, why that evidence provides further, giving us the why or the so what of all of it. What we cannot do and what needs to be avoided is simply, as I said in other videos, to piece outside sourced information together in hopes that that will write the paper for you. It's not exactly how that works. Remember the B model, that much of the source information requires us to interpret, analyze, and to use as, of course, evidence and exhibits, but can also serve as background information. For the sake of claims and evidence, however, let's look at an example. So in an argument with this author, the plus or minus grading system at Radford, student writer Tarek Hodge makes the point that without the A+, students with high grades in the class would be less motivated to work even harder in order to increase their grades. So this is the claim. And then the author illustrates with a quote from a professor who argues students have less incentive to try. And then, of course, explains it that not providing the most motivated students with additional motivation of a higher grade is inequitable. So this would be the explanation of that particular quote, but also it provides the opportunity for the author to add their position on it, right? Their attitudes, beliefs, or whatever it is that they're using that information for. So this is important, and of course this is a very simplified version. It depends on how much information you need to include, but do keep in mind that these elements are necessary, right, in order to keep your claims and all the evidence that support it organized. So if you recall in the video that introduces the different types of arguments for definition or arguments for causation. So those are going to be the points, and making it clear through the wording and language that you're using, that's going to be the point aspect. And then your illustration would be any evidence that you have to support those positions. But of course your explanation that shows. So if you are attempting to argue or present a claim of causation, then that explanation needs to highlight that aspect, show how this mechanism is the thing that caused the course of events. And again, keep in mind the purpose behind the type of argument you are creating. Not all claims are the same. The types of claims equally matter in the kinds of evidence and explanations you will be providing. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about supporting claims. Keep in mind that the concept of claims and warrants and evidence and all logical aspects should be familiar to you already if you've taken an English 100 or 101 course, and some aspects of logic has been introduced at that point. Before we get into this, it's going to be important to revisit the concepts of logical fallacies, and you'll have the video that introduces the concept of warrants as a review in order to understand and make sure that much of what you're doing is logical and reasonable. So let's talk a little bit about the evidence, the types of evidence that you can use. We do have primary and secondary sources. This is something that is also included in the videos that have been provided for you. In that, evidence for academic argument can be based off of primary source material. If you are using historical information, for instance, or a historical topic, primarily primary sources will be used. That is to say, though, isn't to say that primary sources can't be used for other kinds. In these primary source aspects, you're really looking at things like interview surveys, polls, experiments, things that you've created, administered, or firsthand accounts of information, so narratives, things of that nature. And whether or not the claim is going to call for it, it's really going to depend on what you're trying to use that primary source for. As far as evidence that stem from secondary sources, this is material that is secondary in nature in that someone else has analyzed, interpreted, critiqued, criticized, analyzed, all of that from their perspective, and then presents it to, of course, an audience, which would be you. This would require a different level of analysis, right? So it would yes, be partially interpretation, but a lot of it would be critically analyzed to determine whether or not the information is credible, and, you know, of course, relevant to what you're talking about. So in this aspect, as an example, if we're arguing that college instructors should let students use cell phones in class, for instance, primary source material might include a survey that asks students perspectives about using the cell phone or the policy itself. And then a secondary source might include something from Faculty Focus or the Chronicle of Higher Education, which a lot of these issues are debated by different professors and key people in higher ed. So with that being said, again, it comes down to what you need the source for and what would be the most appropriate source for the claim you're making, and also acknowledging the audience and how they might interpret that source as you present it. So as far as how much evidence you need, naturally the answer is it depends. And of course, we've talked about ethos, pathos, and logos, and the concept of kairos, which is a moment, what would be appropriate for this moment of arguing or speaking, for that matter. But it requires a level of skill and balance, which we can talk all day about it, but it really won't appear or it will be obvious to you as you begin writing. It's not something that you can do beforehand, although you can plan for it. But once you start writing and determining the strengths of your own writing, that will determine if you need more evidence or the kind of evidence that you're using. Of course, you want to consider the reasoning, like I said, logical reasoning about this. But as an author, you might want to combine, different types. So anecdotes, facts, case studies, statistics, experiments. And as I've indicated in another video, you also want to acknowledge the type of evidence that's valued within the field. So if we know that in a particular field, primary source or, especially in history, firsthand accounts of experiences tend to be valued, and if all you're using is data that shows statistics, that might be a red flag. So you'll need to monitor and pay attention to that as you are reading the discourse and material in the field. So that's something that you'll want to take into consideration. So, evidence is going to be judged for its logic and for its reason using principles of logic and reason. So you want to make sure that you are reviewing that you are not falling into many logical fallacies, although they tend to happen naturally anyway, and nothing's perfect. But to rely solely on those would be problematic, of course. How you state your claims and how you state your information and explain yourself will be evaluated as well. So those are factors that you'll want to take into consideration. Now, as far as, mapping or diagramming your arguments, it might help judge, what and how you can support your claims adequately, how you decide to appeal. So are you going to appeal to emotion? Are you going to use logical elements of evidence? These are all going to depend on the topic, context, of course, and audience. But you can apply what's called the STAR criteria, which is sufficiency, typicality, accuracy, and relevance. And this is helpful for assessing whether or not your argument has sufficient depth and clarity. So let's kind of look at that a little bit more closely. So if we look at the headings here, we have measure, question, and examples and notes. So for sufficiency, we ask, is there enough evidence cited to support the conclusion or claim that you're making, right? So generally, strongly and not weakly supported conclusions should be the most accepted. The more controversial a claim, the more evidence you're going to need, okay? So as I've indicated about the topic and kinds of claims you're making, if they are more controversial or they have been ones that have not been proven, or you're making one of those claims that has continuously found its way into the rhetoric of some particular type of argument but hasn't necessarily been one that people can defend, then that's a very tall order, especially if you don't have evidence for it. But if the evidence isn't sufficient, of course, you might need to modify the claim, or at least qualify it. So we talked about qualifying claims before, that you recognize and are transparent that there is not sufficient enough evidence for something, but you're qualifying why it might still be true, rather than why it might be sometimes true rather than always true. So that might be something to consider. The typicality is the cited evidence typical or representative? Okay, so if an author makes a claim about a whole group, but the evidence is based on a smaller bias sample. So we call that where we're using, inductive type of reasoning. That might not be, the evidence is not really typical. It's more anecdotal than anything else. And, the small number for evidence isn't enough to make the broader generalization or to serve as strong enough evidence for broader generalization. Now, that doesn't mean you can't use that. So let's say you find a scholarly article where they conduct research, but there was only, 5 participants, and then you're using those 5 participants in that study to make a much stronger claim, or to support a much stronger claim with that. Well, that might not be enough, but that doesn't mean you can't use that in addition to others to demonstrate, right, or to at least corroborate some of the evidence to support that claim. So you'll want to consider that, because it could be considered cherry picking data. And this is very common, to be honest, when it comes to certain articles or attempts at persuading, the public to consume, buy, or whatever the case might be. So be careful with that. You don't want to find that you're using, typical stuff to represent much larger group. Accuracy is the cited evidence up to date and accurate. So in your annotated bibliography, that's probably a great place to determine the accuracy of something. Number one, the date. If you're talking about something like technology, it's always moving and moves quite quickly. So when studies are conducted and polls are conducted, they're often delayed, especially something that has been published. Usually takes about 2 years, and we know that 2 years can mean a lot when it comes to technology. So you want to take that factor into consideration. You'll also want to consider whether or not the information is biased. That's also the other aspect of it. How are the results? Are they skewed? When it came to dissecting the scholarly articles, you had to identify the methods. You had to determine how they drew the conclusions based off the findings. That's where you want to go back, make sure that the accuracy of the information is presented there. So with that being said, if a sample is too small or not well chosen, results may be meaningless, because they may represent just random variations of something. So finally, you have relevance. Is the cited evidence directly relevant to the claims it is being used to support? So one of my biggest positions is about this idea of relatable versus relevance, right? So sometimes it's very easy to find things that are related to the claim, but not necessarily relative. Okay, so we can find, or you might present lots of evidence, but the evidence might support something or a variation of the particular claim you're giving, but not directly supporting that, right? So you want to be mindful that the information is going to be directly relevant to the specific point. In other words, if you are attempting to use an analogy as your point of evidence, right, or if you're attempting to use a statistic to support a particular claim about, gun control, or, about, concealed carry weapons, and then you go on to use evidence from another state, for instance, or that's not relative to another state you're talking about. It might seem relatable, but because their laws are different, significantly different, it might not be something that you can use. A little bit of commentary about the related and relevant information is that we may need to draw on related material if the relevant material isn't available for us. Okay, so while your first source should be something that's relevant, if you're finding that there is no information or it's very limited, so for example, right now we're dealing with COVID, and we're currently in the process of discovering information, getting data and all that, and it's something happening every day. If we can turn to something that's related, or let's say a flu or sort of pandemic of sorts that was similar in regards or related in some way, we can draw upon that. Now, it might not be the strongest for your claim, but it can still serve a purpose in helping us understand how we could potentially process that if there is no information available to us. So with these particular strategies in mind, and including some of the other topics and concepts in the other videos, again, this is just another added layer of things that you'll have to consider. One of the takeaways, of course, is the PI element, where you have your point, illustration, explanation, and as it relates to evidence is looking at the STAR method. So that will be elements I will be evaluating you on as well. So take these factors into consideration as you're developing your writing and also through the process of revision. If you have any questions about any of these elements, please feel free to contact me.